When Elijah was discharged, everyone smiled. The doctor spoke confidently, explaining that the tests were normal and that rest would be enough. The way people do when they believe certainty is kindness. Relief entered the room before doubt did, settling like permission to breathe again. Naomi smiled too, though her hand stayed wrapped around Elijah's longer than necessary. She had learned over the years that relief could be fragile, but she didn't want to fracture the moment by questioning it. Hope, when offered cleanly, is hard to refuse. The drive home felt quieter than usual. Naomi kept one hand on the steering wheel and one resting on Elijah's knee, grounding herself in the warmth of him still being there. When she asked if he felt better, he said almost, because almost felt honest and hopeful at the same time. That night, Elijah woke before dawn, sitting upright in bed, breath caught somewhere between his chest and throat. He waited in the dark, counting slowly until the pressure loosened its grip, because fear feels heavier when shared too quickly. Pain learned how to hide inside him, disguising itself as exhaustion. At the follow-up appointment, Naomi spoke more than Elijah did. She described the way his color changed in the mornings, the way sleep no longer rested him, the way his hands sometimes trembled without reason. The nurse smiled politely and said, "Recovery isn't linear," a phrase practiced enough to sound reassuring. Concern was met with reassurance instead of attention. They left with pamphlets and instructions they already knew how to follow. The parking lot felt brighter than it should have. At home, Naomi still laughed with him at dinner. They planned a short trip they might never take, talking about it carefully, as if naming the future could anchor it. Love sometimes pretends nothing has changed to keep hope alive. But Elijah's body remembered what paperwork had erased. His hands shook when he lifted a glass, subtle enough to dismiss, persistent enough to notice. Fatigue replaced strength without explanation, like a tide that doesn't announce itself before rising. Night grew quieter and heavier. Naomi lay awake, listening to his breathing, memorizing its rhythm the way people do when they're afraid of silence. Fear entered the house without knocking and learned where everything was. When Naomi insisted on a second opinion, Elijah didn't argue. He was tired of explaining symptoms that felt invisible once spoken aloud. The second doctor paused longer than the first, rereading scans that had already been cleared. Silence became the loudest answer. The doctor's voice lowered when he finally spoke, careful not to sound accusatory, careful not to sound late. Internal bleeding that should have been caught days earlier had spread damage quietly, efficiently. Being cleared had not meant being safe. Naomi felt the room tilt as the words settled into place. Truth, when delayed, carries weight. She cried alone in the hospital bathroom, hands braced against the sink to keep from folding inward. Elijah apologized for something that wasn't his fault, because guilt often arrives faster than logic. Tragedy rarely announces where responsibility actually belongs. The hours passed without updates. Naomi counted ceiling tiles and memories, replaying moments she'd ignored because she'd been told everything was fine. Suspense stretches time into something unrecognizable. Elijah lived. Survival arrived quietly, without celebration, followed immediately by boundaries that hadn't existed before. Life returned, altered, demanding adjustment instead of relief. They learned new routines. Naomi measured days in medications and moods, learning which silences meant rest and which meant pain. Love adjusted instead of leaving. Friends celebrated Elijah's survival with smiles and congratulations. Only Naomi saw what it cost him afterward. The way confidence gave way to caution. The way laughter arrived slower. Trauma often hides behind gratitude. Weeks later, a letter arrived from the hospital. It used words like regret and review, language designed to acknowledge without absorbing consequence. No word restored what had been lost. The investigation confirmed the error. No one was fired, only retrained, and no policy mentioned their names. Accountability remained theoretical. Elijah worried he was no longer the man Naomi married. She reminded him, love isn't based on capacity. That partnership changes shape without breaking. Romance matured into something quieter and stronger. They never took the trip they planned. Instead, they took slower walks, learning how to move through the world differently together. Elijah eventually understood that clearance is not care. Naomi understood that intuition matters even when dismissed politely. Love understood it would have to carry what systems dropped. Elijah was declared healthy. What followed proved how fragile that word can be.